Whoa, whoa. Here I come.
Oh.
Here I come.
Oh.
Have you ever heard of a gang so ruthless that even the police feared them? In a city booming with opportunity, where Henry Ford's revolutionary assembly line had transformed Detroit into an industrial powerhouse, something dark was brewing. A group emerged, ruthless and unstoppable, the infamous Purple Gang. They didn't just mess around. They ran their city's underworld with a mix of power and fear that made them stand out. But what would make a group of individuals rise to power in the heart of the Prohibition era, and yet remain shrouded in mystery for decades? What were their true motives? Was it pure ambition, or something darker? And what led to their eventual downfall? Well, stay with us till the end as we unravel the secrets behind this forgotten chapter of American crime history. The 1920s were a time of bold change and wild nights in America. Jazz echoed from clubs, flappers danced with carefree abandon, and secret nightclubs promised forbidden thrills. But behind this glittering world there was a darker side, one filled with danger, violence, and the brutal grip of organized crime. Prohibition, the law that banned alcohol, didn't stop the drinking. Instead, it opened the floodgates for criminals looking to cash in on the black market. And Detroit? It became the kingdom of one of the most feared groups of the era, the Purple Gang. Unlike any other gang, the Purple Gang didn't just deal in bootlegging. They were chaotic, fierce, and seemingly unstoppable. Their violence was unmatched, and their ambitions were high. They didn't just intimidate the streets, they even made other criminals and the police nervous. Yes, you heard that right. Everyone, from everyday citizens to other criminals, knew that crossing the Purple Gang was a mistake you wouldn't live to regret. At the height of their power, the Purple Gang stretched beyond Detroit, casting shadows over state lines and becoming a name whispered in fear across the country. Yet, like all empires forged in blood and crime, their rule wouldn't last forever. Just as quickly as they had risen, things took a dark turn. Despite the gang's near-legendary status, something within would ultimately undo them, a twist no one saw coming. But before we dive deeper into the reign of terror that the Purple Gang unleashed on Detroit, let's rewind a bit to understand how they rose from the tough streets of the city's immigrant neighborhoods to become one of America's most feared criminal organizations. Detroit in the early 1900s was a place of opportunity and growth. The booming automotive industry, thanks largely to Henry Ford's revolutionary assembly line, transformed the city into a powerhouse, drawing people from all over, including a large wave of immigrants seeking work and a better life. Many of these immigrants were Jewish families from Eastern Europe, fleeing persecution and poverty. They settled into neighborhoods like Hastings Street, a crowded area bustling with life but also with challenges. For many young men growing up there, the options were limited, jobs were scarce, and discrimination was common. Some found honest work, but others turned to the streets for survival. And it was in these rough environments that the beginnings of the Purple Gang took root. But do you know how this gang got their name? Well, the actual story behind the Purple Gang is shrouded in mystery. Some say it came from street vendors who called them tainted or off-color, linking them to the color purple. Others claim it was inspired by a meeting where someone wore a purple sweater, or by a taxi company called Purple Line that used the gang to wage a trade war. Some even say it came from the dye used during the Cleaners and Dyers War. Now, at first, the Purple Gang wasn't the feared organization they later became. In fact, they began as just a group of unruly teenagers causing trouble around Detroit's Little Jerusalem area, known for petty crimes like shoplifting, pickpocketing, and vandalism. They were the kind of kids who'd steal fruit and candy from local merchants or pickpocket people on the streets. But they were also fearless, clever, and hard to catch, always managing to stay one step ahead of the police. They first came together at Bishop School, where they learned the ropes of crime, started causing disruptions, and eventually earned the nickname Sugar House Boys, after a connection to mobsters Charles Leader and Henry Shore, who ran the Oakland Sugar House. The Purple Gang's roots trace back to Sammy Purple Cohen, but it was the Bernstein brothers, Abe, Isidore, and Ray, who took control. They had moved to Detroit from New York with big plans. What started as petty crimes like shoplifting and extortion quickly escalated, along with other original members like Harry Fleischer, Henry Shore, Eddie Fletcher, Irving Milberg, Harry Altman, Harry Keywell, and Morris and Phil Rader. The gang eventually merged, forming the fearsome Purple Gang under Abe's ruthless leadership. The timing was perfect. America was in the grip of Prohibition, a nationwide ban on the manufacture and sale of alcohol that started in 1920. This ban, instead of stopping drinking, only fueled a massive underground demand for liquor. People wanted alcohol, and they were willing to pay good money for it. This was exactly the opportunity the Bernsteins were looking for. The Purple Gang's big break came with their entry into the world of bootlegging. Detroit, as it happened, was uniquely suited to the liquor trade. Sitting right on the border with Canada, the city provided easy access to a steady supply of alcohol from across the Detroit River. Canadian whiskey and other spirits could be smuggled into Detroit and then distributed throughout the Midwest. The Bernsteins and their gang seized this opportunity, forming connections with Canadian suppliers and building a highly profitable smuggling operation. They soon controlled one of the busiest smuggling routes in the country, moving large quantities of alcohol across the river under the cover of night. As they moved into the lucrative world of bootlegging, the Purple Gang began gathering wealth, power, and influence. But with that came competition, and they weren't ones to share the profits, unlike some of the more structured and professional gangs in places like New York or Chicago. The Purple Gang had a reputation for being wild, chaotic, and extremely violent. They weren't afraid to use brutal tactics to eliminate anyone who dared to challenge them. Extortion, arson, bombings, and outright murder became their signatures. They didn't just get rid of rivals. They made examples of them in the most public and gruesome ways possible, sending a message to anyone who might think about crossing them. By the mid-1920s, the Purple Gang had effectively taken control of Detroit's illegal liquor trade, raking in millions of dollars. Their connections extended far beyond Detroit, too. They had ties with powerful figures in the criminal underworld, including the infamous Al Capone from Chicago. With these alliances, they were able to expand their influence, solidifying their reputation as one of the most ruthless criminal organizations in America. The Purple Gang was also known for its unpredictability. While other gangs operated with a certain code or discipline, the Purple Gang was considered uncontrollable and even dangerous to their own allies. Their violent outbursts were notorious, and their rivals, and sometimes even their own members, could be killed over the smallest perceived slights. One Detroit police officer famously remarked, "They would shoot a guy for looking at them sideways." Their unpredictable nature and refusal to conform to the norms of organized crime made them a unique threat. The police were often reluctant to confront them directly, knowing that any interaction with the Purple Gang could quickly turn deadly. Even other criminals, seasoned in the dangerous world of organized crime, were cautious around them. They had earned a reputation for being untouchable. At their peak, the Purple Gang's grip on Detroit was so tight that it was said nothing happened in the city without their knowledge or approval. But do you think the Purple Gang just stuck to bootlegging, or did they have bigger plans in mind? Well, the Purple Gang didn't just want money. They wanted to own Detroit's criminal underworld, and by the late 1920s they found a unique path to power: the city's booming laundry industry. The story goes that Detroit's laundries and dry cleaners, essential businesses for a growing urban population, became the gang's next big target. The industry was thriving, but it was also riddled with labor disputes, and the Purple Gang saw an opportunity. They didn't just step into the industry. They tore it apart and rebuilt it under their control in what would come to be called the Cleaners and Dyers War. The gang approached laundry business owners with an offer they couldn't refuse: protection from violence and sabotage. But there was a dark twist. The people threatening these businesses were none other than the Purple Gang themselves. Owners who cooperated and paid the fees could keep their businesses running safely. But if they dared to refuse, their shops would be bombed, employees assaulted, and anyone who resisted would feel the wrath of the gang's fierce reputation. The Cleaners and Dyers War turned the city's laundries into a battleground. Bombings became frequent, and rumors of gangsters roughing up business owners spread fear through Detroit's commercial circles. Before long, the Purple Gang held a firm grip over the entire laundry industry, making them richer and more powerful than ever. But for the Purple Gang, it was a strategic move to assert their dominance. Their control of the laundry industry was a clear message. They weren't just players in Detroit's underworld, they were its rulers, and their influence stretched far beyond laundry. By now they dominated the bootlegging business, controlling who could sell alcohol in a city that was desperate for a drink during Prohibition. It's hard to imagine the extent of their power, The Purple Gang was so feared that even local law enforcement hesitated to take them on. Many officers were on the gang's payroll, paid to look the other way, or worse, actively protect gang interests. For the few cops who tried to take a stand, the consequences were often dire. The gang had no problem sending a clear message to anyone who crossed them, and that message was always delivered in blood. Fast forward to 1929, and the Purple Gang found themselves involved in one of the most infamous events in gangster history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. It all started with a bitter rivalry between George "Bugs" Moran's North Side Gang and Al Capone's powerful outfit in Chicago. Capone was looking to eliminate Moran, but he needed inside information to pull off a major strike. That's where the Purple Gang came in. Although they didn't pull the triggers themselves, the Purple Gang reportedly played a key role in the massacre. They had clashed with Moran over bootlegging routes and held a deep resentment against him. According to reports, they tipped off Capone about Moran's operations, leading to the fateful day when 7 members of Moran's gang were lined up against a wall and ruthlessly gunned down by men dressed as police officers. The massacre sent shockwaves through Chicago and beyond, marking a turning point in the gang wars. For the Purple Gang, it was both a victory and a curse. By helping Capone take down Moran, they strengthened their position in the criminal network and built a fearsome reputation as key players in organized crime. But it also marked a new chapter of scrutiny. The high-profile event brought the spotlight of law enforcement, not just on Capone, but on the Purple Gang as well. Their connection to such a notorious massacre meant that authorities could no longer turn a blind eye to their operations. As the government started cracking down on organized crime, the Purple Gang's days of unchecked power were coming to an end. Rivalries within their ranks, erratic behavior, and a reputation that had grown too large for their own good would ultimately lead to their undoing. They had ruled Detroit with brutal efficiency, but their own ambitions and violent ways would eventually seal their fate. By now you must be thinking that law enforcement was the Purple Gang's biggest enemy, right? But you'd be mistaken. In fact, the real threat to the gang didn't come from the police at all. The Purple Gang's strength lay in their fearsome reputation and their unity. But as the 1930s began, cracks started to show. The gang's founders, the Bernstein brothers, began to lose control as greed, jealousy, paranoia, and mistrust crept in. Members became suspicious of each other, and the fear of betrayal hung in the air. In a world where loyalty was the only shield, that loyalty was suddenly at risk. The unraveling hit a critical point in 1931. 3 of the gang's own, Hyman Yiddy Bloom, Joe Sutker, and George Lewis, attempted to break away. They wanted to form their own operation, one that would free them from the Bernsteins' shadow. But this was no small step. It was viewed as treason. The Bernsteins didn't just see it as a betrayal. They saw it as a threat that needed to be handled swiftly and severely, one that demanded blood. So, on a tense day in September 1931, Bloom, Sutker, and Lewis were invited to a peace meeting at an apartment on Collingwood Avenue. But there was no truce waiting for them. Instead, they walked into a trap. The 3 men were ambushed and executed by their former associates in what became known as the Collingwood Manor Massacre. The massacre was a clear message. Betrayal would not be tolerated. Yet this brutal response to betrayal did more harm than good. Instead of solidifying the gang's power, it exposed their weaknesses. The Collingwood Manor Massacre drew law enforcement's attention like never before, and police resources were now entirely focused on dismantling the Purple Gang. This event opened the floodgates for police crackdowns, and soon, key members like Abe Bernstein's right-hand man, Harry Keywell, found themselves behind bars. The gang's reign started crumbling rapidly. By 1933, Prohibition had been repealed, cutting off their main source of income. With the police no longer looking the other way, the gang's empire quickly unraveled. Members were either jailed, killed, or went into hiding. By the decade's end, the once feared Purple Gang was nothing but a memory. But their legacy lived on. They had shaped Detroit's crime scene, leaving behind a blueprint for future gangs that would adopt their methods of violence, extortion, and smuggling. Methods that would haunt organized crime in America for years to come. Now, the story of the Purple Gang is one of both power and downfall. At their peak, they were the uncontested rulers of Detroit's underworld. This gang wasn't just known for their violence, but for their ability to strike fear into everyone they crossed. Even their fellow criminals were wary of them. But like most empires built on chaos, the Purple Gang couldn't escape the dangers of their own violence and greed. Their rise was fast, but their fall came even quicker. The same unpredictability that made them feared also tore them apart from within. In the end, their biggest threat didn't come from rival gangs or the law, but from betrayal in their own ranks. And that, ultimately, led to their dramatic end. Now, what do you think of the Purple Gang's rise and fall? Were they destined to crash, or could they have held on to their power? Let us know in the comments below. And if you thought this story was deadly, then you better not check the story of Typhoid Mary.